So next up, we want to break down the inheritance of genetic disorders. There are a lot of different diseases that occur as a result of mutations in DNA. The abnormal gene can then be passed down through the sperm or the egg. Now, the parents may or may not be affected, but they can still pass genetic disorders down to their offspring. Or genetic mutations might be new. Genetic mutations can arise all the time, and they may not have been necessarily present in the parent generation, but may be new in the offspring. So a great example of one of the things that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about autosomal recessive genetic disorders and autosomal dominant disorders. In the case of an autosomal recessive disorder, we're going to see that if both parents carry one copy of a recessive gene, they are going to be completely unaffected. However, they would be capable of having a child with two copies of the gene who is affected. A great example of this would be cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is the most common autosomal recessive disorder. What happens is that mucus in the bronchial tubes and pancreatic ducts is going to become particularly thick and viscous. This is due to a misfolded chlorine ion channel protein. So remember when we talked about, chlorine is an ion. Does anybody remember what an ion is, or what does it mean that it's an ion? An ion is a charged molecule or a charged atom. It's any atom that has one too many or one too few electrons. The chlorine ion specifically has an extra electron. This gives it a negative charge. Can charged molecules pass through the cell membrane? No, they cannot. Charged molecules are polar molecules. Polar molecules like polar molecules. Water is found inside the cell. Water is found outside of the cell. Chlorine preferentially wants to hang out with water here or hang out with water here, but he does not want to pass through the nonpolar lipid tails of the cell membrane. So chlorine cannot pass through the membrane, cannot diffuse through the membrane because of its charge. So what's going to happen is you have ion channels that are embedded throughout your plasma membrane. These ion channels allow chlorine ions to go through. As chlorine diffuses across the membrane, water is also going to follow. As chlorine moves across the plasma membrane, it's going to change the concentration gradient, and it's going to cause water to move down its concentration gradient as well. Now here's the problem. In the case of cystic fibrosis, what you end up with is, you have a gene for a misfolded chlorine ion channel. So what happens is this tiny little channel is malformed. It's sort of like the tunnel is blocked off. With this malformed channel, chlorine ions can't pass through. Chlorine ions can't pass through, water won't pass through. Water needs to pass through to get to the other side in order to thin out the mucus that's found outside of your cells. So what happens is, in the case of cystic fibrosis, without this proper working channel, you end up with a very thick, sticky mucus that coats the inside of your lungs. It doesn't allow your cilia to beat properly, and it doesn't allow for proper oxygenation of your blood without proper aeration and movement of those cilia. So this is going to be by far the most common recessive autosomal disorder that is also lethal. That would be cystic fibrosis. About 1 in 20 individuals are carriers, but only about 1 in 2,000 will actually have the disorder. Now, this is because an individual who is homozygous dominant does not have the disorder, does not carry it. An individual who is heterozygous does not have the disorder, but they will be a carrier for this disorder. This individual can pass it on to their offspring. An individual who is homozygous recessive will have the disorder. So cystic fibrosis, like I said, is caused by a defective chlorine ion channel carrier protein. It's encoded for by the CFTR gene on the chromosome 7. Research has shown that the chlorine ion simply cannot pass through the defective ion channels on the plasma membrane, and the movement of those chloride ions is so important because it creates an unequal concentration gradient that forces water and sodium ions to follow. The lack of water can cause abnormally thick and sticky mucus to build up on the lung epithelial cells, preventing the normal function of the lungs. There have been many recent advancements in the gene therapies for the treatment of cystic fibrosis that have ultimately increased the life expectancy of the individual with cystic fibrosis to 35 years, but it is ultimately still a fatal disorder. Until they can treat the replacement of, or until we can replace those missing chlorine ion channels, it's just it's a problem that has not yet been solved. So in the case of an autosomal recessive disorder, we have individuals who are carriers. A carrier is simply a heterozygote. They carry the recessive trait, but the phenotype is dominant, meaning they're not showing that recessive disorder. With an autosomal recessive trait, if both parents are affected, all of the children will be affected. In other words, if both parents are recessive or homozygous recessive for the individual, all of their offspring will be homozygous recessive. Now, there are also autosomal dominant disorders. In the case of an autosomal dominant disorder, affected individuals have only one abnormal allele. So an example of this would be Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is caused by a defect in the production of an elastic connective tissue called fibrillin. Now, some of the symptoms for Marfan syndrome include discolated lens, long limbs, fingers, caved-in chest, weakened wall of the aorta. There are treatments like beta blockers to control the cardiovascular symptoms, corrective lenses or eye surgery, braces and orthopedic surgery for musculoskeletal symptoms, but it's ultimately going to result in weakened brittle bones. Now, the interesting thing is this is caused by mutations in two genes for a type 1 collagen. It's one of the most abundant proteins in the human body. That collagen is going to provide strength and rigidity to the bones, and it's also going to form the framework for most of the tissues. So it's a pretty important disorder. There's also another autosomal dominant genetic disorder would be Huntington disease. This is a progressive degeneration of brain cells caused by mutation in the protein huntingtin. Huntingtin forms clumps inside of neurons that render them inactive. Now, the symptoms don't tend to appear until the late 30s to late 40s, but it can result in uncontrolled movements, unsteady gait, dementia, speech impairment. Patients typically live about 10 to 20 years after the onset of those symptoms. All right, so you should be able to solve some problems based on autosomal recessive and autosomal disorders. I know we didn't focus on pedigree charts in this particular section. They are included. They are pretty interesting. But specifically, I want you to focus on autosomal recessive traits or autosomal recessive disorders and predicting the appearance of those disorders throughout several generations. So you should be able to predict the chances that a homozygous normal parents for cystic fibrosis will have a child with cystic fibrosis. So homozygous normal parents for cystic fibrosis, what are the likelihood that they will have offspring with cystic fibrosis? You should also be able to explain why some incidences of autosomal recessive disorders can be higher in one race or culture. Now, we didn't go over that in this section, but you can read about it in the textbook. I won't be quizzing you on that particular instance, but it is a very interesting read. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.